I never thought the people I loved most would turn into the ones who destroyed me. At 2 a.m., my mother's voice cracked through the phone, begging me to hand half of everything I owned to my brother. When I refused, the life I had built from nothing was reduced to ashes, burned down by the very hands I once trusted. But this wasn't the end. That fire lit something inside me, a vow to fight back, to expose every hidden betrayal, and to take them to court. What the judge revealed didn't just change my life, it shook the entire city. I still remember the night it all began. The clock on my bedside table glowed 2 a.m. when the phone buzzed violently across the nightstand. My mother's voice came through, shaky and drenched in tears. "You have to help your brother," she begged. "He's drowning, and you're the only one who can save him. Give him half of what you have. If you don't, you'll tear this family apart, Ania." Her words, though soaked in desperation, carried the familiar weight of expectation I had grown up with, an unspoken rule that my life, my money, my very identity existed to serve them. As I listened, my chest tightened with the same reflex I had known since childhood: guilt. I had been raised on the mantra that family was everything, that blood outweighed boundaries, and that obedience equaled love. I remembered the countless times I had been praised for sacrificing, sharing toys I didn't want to, babysitting when I had exams the next day, wiring money I couldn't afford to spare. And every time I gave in, I was rewarded with affection, brief and conditional, like a pat on the head for a loyal dog. That was love in my family, transactional, manipulative, and suffocating. But at 2 a.m., lying in the dark with my mother's words pressing against my eardrums, something felt different. There was no warmth in her voice, no gratitude, just a command disguised as desperation. I realized, perhaps for the first time, that what I had always called love was more like a binding contract written without my consent. The truth unsettled me, but I still struggled to accept it. After all, how could I question the very people who raised me? The answer came to me slowly, like water seeping through cracks. Over the years, there had been signs, flashing red lights I had chosen to ignore. I remembered the day I discovered the family group chat I wasn't part of. My sister accidentally left her phone unlocked on the kitchen table. A quick glance revealed conversations that cut me deeper than any blade. Jokes about me, plans to borrow money I hadn't offered, sneering remarks about my independence. It wasn't just behind my back gossip, it was coordination, a deliberate effort to undermine me. Then there was the financial manipulation. I would lend money to cover an emergency, only to find months later that it had been used for a vacation. Promises to pay me back evaporated into thin air. Whenever I dared to ask about it, I was met with gaslighting. "You're imagining things," they would say. "Didn't you say it was a gift? Why are you being so dramatic?" Over time, I learned to doubt my memory, to question my own perception of reality. Isolation was another weapon in their arsenal. They would invite friends and distant relatives to gatherings while conveniently forgetting to tell me. They would leave me out of family photos, or worse, include me only to mock the way I looked. At first, I told myself it was unintentional, a simple oversight. But patterns don't lie. It was a strategy, a way to remind me that I was on the outside no matter how much I gave. Even secrets were wielded like chains. There were family decisions I never knew about until it was too late. Properties sold, money borrowed, agreements signed with my name attached. I was always the last to find out, and when I confronted them, I was dismissed as overreacting. "You don't need to worry about that," they'd say. "We're protecting you." Yet each secret chipped away at my autonomy until I barely recognized myself as an adult. By the time my mother's 2 a.m. plea came, these signs should have painted a clear picture. But I was so tangled in the web of trauma bonding that I convinced myself it was normal. I believed the narrative that loyalty meant silence, that love meant sacrifice, and that questioning them meant betrayal. I had been conditioned to accept pain as proof of devotion. That night, though, something cracked. I hung up the phone and lay in the silence, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The thought came uninvited. What if love isn't supposed to feel like this? The question was small, almost a whisper, but it rattled the foundation of everything I thought I knew. I sat up in bed and began to mentally check off the red flags: financial manipulation, emotional blackmail, gaslighting, isolation, information control. It was like a checklist unfolding in front of me, a self-assessment I had never dared to complete. Each box I ticked left me more unsettled, but also more awake. For the first time, I was confronting the truth instead of burying it under excuses. Still, the realization came with a cost. My body trembled with anger, confusion, and fear. If I acknowledged the truth, it meant admitting that the people I loved most had been using me all along. It meant accepting that my loyalty had been a weapon against me. And worst of all, it meant I had wasted years believing I was loved when, in reality, I had been controlled. As dawn crept through the blinds, I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. I knew I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't erase the years of manipulation or reclaim the pieces of myself I had given away. The damage was done, but one thought pulsed louder than the rest, echoing like a drumbeat in my skull. This was only the beginning. My family had taken advantage of my loyalty for years, but the worst was yet to come. And when it arrived, it would shatter me in ways I never imagined. The family meeting had been planned like a trap, though I didn't recognize it at first. They invited me to my parents' house under the pretense of a casual dinner. When I arrived, the tension was already thick in the air. My mother sat stiffly at the head of the table, my father silent beside her. My brother leaned back in his chair, smug, as though he already knew the outcome. The air smelled of cooked meat and something sour beneath it, resentment perhaps. The moment I sat down, the conversation turned sharp. "We need you to sign this," my mother said, sliding a stack of papers across the table. My heart skipped when I saw what it was. A transfer agreement. Half of my house, the one I had worked years to buy, would be handed to my brother. I laughed in disbelief at first, thinking it was some sick joke. But their faces didn't break. "You're his sister," my father said coldly. "It's your responsibility to make sure he has a fair share." "He hasn't worked a steady job in years," I argued. "Why should I give him half of everything I built?" My brother smirked, leaning forward. "Because family means sacrifice. You wouldn't want to be the selfish one, would you?" That old familiar guilt twisted in my gut, but something inside me snapped. I pushed the papers back across the table. "No, not this time." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face hardened, her tears vanishing as quickly as they came. My father's jaw clenched. My brother muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out, leaving their shocked stares behind me. That night, I woke to the smell of smoke. Flames clawed at the windows, eating away at everything I owned. By the time the fire trucks arrived, my home, my safe place, my proof of independence, was nothing but charred remains. Standing on the street, barefoot, shivering in the cold night air, I watched the life I had built collapse into ash. But the worst came after. Within hours, whispers began to spread. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't recognize, acquaintances forwarding rumors that I had burned my own house down for insurance money. The story was spreading faster than the fire itself, and I knew exactly where it started. My family. The people who should have stood beside me were painting me as a criminal. I wasn't just grieving a home, I was grieving the death of my reputation. Overnight, I had gone from victim to suspect. Even neighbors who had seen me crying on the street began to look at me differently. Doubt hung in their eyes. It didn't matter that the fire marshal confirmed arson. The seed of suspicion had already been planted. For days, I sank into a fog of shock and despair. I replayed every moment of that dinner, every word, wondering how I could have prevented this. My emotions swung wildly, rage, sorrow, disbelief. But slowly, another feeling began to rise from beneath the rubble. Clarity. If I didn't fight back, I would be erased, my name, my dignity, my future destroyed. That realization changed everything. I couldn't afford to react emotionally anymore. If my family wanted war, I would not enter the battlefield unarmed. I began with discipline. I carried a recorder in my pocket during phone calls and visits, capturing every threat, every slip of the tongue. I archived texts, saved voicemails, backed up every digital trace. I created a timeline of events, the phone call at 2 a.m., the family meeting, the night of the fire, dates, times, witnesses. I forced myself to view it like an investigator, not a daughter. Each piece of evidence was a shield, each document a weapon. It wasn't easy. Every recording cut me like a blade. Hearing my mother's voice laced with venom, my brother's laughter as he mocked me behind my back, it tore at me. But I reminded myself, pain could either destroy me or sharpen me. I chose the latter. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. While combing through financial records, I stumbled across something that froze me in my tracks. A loan application with my name signed at the bottom. The problem? I had never signed it. My brother had forged my signature, backed by my parents' silence, to secure tens of thousands in debt. The weight of the betrayal nearly crushed me. I sat staring at the document, my hands shaking. They hadn't just taken from me. They had built an entire scheme around my identity, my trust, my life. It was no longer about manipulation or emotional games. This was fraud, criminal, and it gave me the leverage I desperately needed. That discovery flipped the board. No longer was I the hunted. I had proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that they were not just toxic, but dangerous. They wanted to ruin me, but in their greed, they had left fingerprints all over their crimes. I closed my laptop with a steady hand, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Resolve. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was strategy. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would not crumble. The rules had changed. The game was mine now. I woke the next morning with a new kind of determination. Grief and rage had nearly drowned me, but now they sharpened into focus. My family thought they had silenced me with fire and lies. Instead, they had forced me into clarity. I knew what had to be done. The first step was evidence. Every phone call, every casual conversation became an opportunity. I carried a recorder with me everywhere, slipping it into my pocket before answering unknown calls. When my mother phoned to berate me for destroying the family's reputation, I let her words flow, calm and venomous, right into the device. My brother's text messages, full of arrogance and half-hidden threats, were screenshotted, duplicated, and backed up in multiple places. I was no longer a daughter responding to family drama. I was an investigator cataloging a crime. I installed a discreet camera near the remains of my house, hoping they would be foolish enough to return. Even if they didn't, the footage captured neighbors whispering about what they had seen that night. Each testimony added weight to my file. I requested bank statements going back years, combing through them like a surgeon. I traced deposits and withdrawals, following the trail until it led to the fraudulent loan they had taken in my name. It was all there: amounts, signatures, timestamps. Painful to look at, but impossible to ignore. The work was exhausting. Each document reminded me of betrayal. Each audio clip replayed the voices of the people who should have loved me most. Some nights I would sit, surrounded by papers and recordings, my chest tight, tears burning my eyes. But even in those moments, I forced myself to keep going. Pain was a companion, but clarity was my guide. I studied similar cases, reading about others who had faced inheritance theft or family fraud. One story in particular stuck with me: a woman whose siblings siphoned her inheritance for years, while convincing her she was financially irresponsible. Her breakthrough came when she collected a single, undeniable piece of evidence: a forged will that shattered their scheme in court. That case became my reminder. One piece of proof could outweigh years of manipulation. And yet, as my files grew thicker, I realized there was still something missing. Documents and recordings were powerful, but I needed something that spoke louder than paper or tape. I needed a voice, a person who could stand beside me in court and say, "I saw what happened." That was the kind of evidence that could turn everything upside down. Finding such a person, however, required trust, and trust was something I no longer gave lightly. I started by reaching out to people cautiously. My lawyer became my anchor, helping me understand what would hold up in court and what would not. She showed me how to organize my timeline into a legal narrative, not just a personal one. My therapist reminded me that strength wasn't about suppressing emotions, but channeling them. Each session became a quiet breath, a reminder that I was more than the war I was fighting. Neighbors who had seen the fire were hesitant at first, afraid of being caught in the middle. But one by one, they came forward, willing to sign statements. A colleague from work vouched for my financial stability, countering the rumors my family spread. I began building what my lawyer called safe channels, witnesses and allies who could verify the truth beyond my own words. Every signed document, every sworn statement became another layer of armor. Then came the surprise I hadn't expected. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, reached out. She had stayed silent for years, a quiet observer of the chaos, too afraid to challenge her family. But now, with everything unraveling, she couldn't stay quiet any longer. She came to my apartment one evening, her hands trembling as she handed me a folder. Inside were letters, old emails, and even recordings she had kept over the years. Proof of conversations where my mother and brother discussed plans to manipulate me, to corner me financially, to ensure I never broke free. Her eyes welled with tears as she confessed, "I should have spoken sooner, but I was scared. They silenced me too. But you're not alone anymore." I held the folder like it was gold. For years I had been isolated, convinced that no one saw what was happening. And yet here was undeniable proof that someone had not only seen, but preserved the truth. It was more than evidence, it was validation. The weight of loneliness began to lift. I realized I wasn't fighting as one against many anymore. I had a team now, a lawyer who believed in me, a therapist who steadied me, neighbors and colleagues who were willing to stand beside me, and now an aunt who had carried secrets in silence until she found the courage to speak. I looked around my apartment at the piles of evidence, the neatly stacked folders, the flash drives labeled with dates and times. My life had transformed from chaos into order, from reactive fear into deliberate action. The war my family had started wasn't over, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was prepared. And as I closed the folder my aunt had given me, I whispered to myself, steady and certain, "Now, with a team behind me, it's time to strike back." Revenge, I learned, was not about rage. It was about timing. My lawyer and I pored over calendars, discussing the possible court dates, and when the judge announced the trial would fall, on the same week as my brother's birthday, I knew it was fate. He had always believed life revolved around him, that every celebration was proof of his importance. This time, the spotlight would still be his, but it would burn him instead of praise him. Preparation became ritual. We curated the evidence carefully, stacking it in an order that would have maximum impact. The forged loan documents came first, undeniable proof of fraud. Then the recordings, my mother's voice dripping with venom, my brother's taunts. The folder my aunt had given me would close the show, revealing years of planning and betrayal in their own words. My lawyer called it the Christmas revelation, a comparison to another case she had tried, where evidence unveiled at the holidays shattered an entire family in front of their community. The trick was not just having the truth, but knowing when to let it detonate. The courthouse buzzed with reporters, neighbors, and distant relatives drawn by the scandal. The gallery was packed. Whispers filled the air, as though the entire city had gathered to watch my downfall, or my resurrection. My brother entered smirking, dressed like a man going to a party rather than a trial. My parents followed, their faces tight with false grief, ready to play their roles. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled, but my voice was steady. We began with the documents, each page projected onto the screen for everyone to see. My brother's smug expression flickered, the first crack in his mask. The recordings followed. The courtroom grew still as my mother's voice echoed through the speakers, words laced with manipulation that no performance could disguise. But the moment that silenced even the whispers was when my aunt took the stand. She pulled out her folder, her hands shaking, as she read aloud the words she had kept hidden for years. My brother leaned forward, furious, whispering to his lawyer, while my mother shook her head as though denying reality. Yet there it was, proof irrefutable, undeniable. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, I thought I had won. But families like mine don't go quietly. The very next day, they struck back. Newspapers suddenly carried anonymous sources, claiming I had fabricated evidence. Social media accounts accused me of being unstable, of having a history of lies. Flying monkeys, friends of the family, distant cousins, even old neighbors, emerged to defend them, repeating the narrative they had crafted for years. I became the villain again in a smear campaign designed to undo everything. But I had anticipated this. My lawyer had prepared countermeasures. We released official statements, careful and measured, accompanied by certified documents. We avoided engaging with the noise, locking down my accounts, ensuring no slip could be used against me. Every move was deliberate. For every lie they spread, I had two truths waiting. Then came their boldest move yet. On the third day of trial, their attorney unveiled what he called proof that I had set the fire myself, a witness statement and a questionable insurance document. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For a heartbeat, panic surged through me. Had they found a way to undo everything? But then my lawyer stood, calm as a stone. She revealed that the so-called witness had been paid, the statement full of contradictions. The insurance document bore a timestamp that made it impossible. It had been created days after the fire. It wasn't just a weak attempt, it was perjury. The judge's face hardened, and suddenly the spotlight shifted entirely. My family had overplayed their hand, and the trap they set for me closed around them instead. The gallery erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. My brother's birthday had become the stage for his public undoing, his reputation collapsing in real time. My mother's eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy that no longer existed. My father sat frozen, the mask finally slipping to reveal the fear beneath. As the session adjourned, I walked out of the courtroom into the flashing cameras, my legs weak but my spirit unbroken. I knew the war wasn't finished. Their tactics would continue, their smear campaigns would linger. But something fundamental had shifted. The tide had turned, and for the first time, they were the ones scrambling for cover. I breathed deeply in the cool evening air, the courthouse lights casting long shadows across the street. The fight had been brutal, but now, as the dust began to settle, one truth rose above the noise. Lies can roar, but the truth has a weight they can never escape. And soon, when the chaos quieted, that truth would shine brighter than ever. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. My brother sat slouched in his chair, his once cocky grin replaced with pale disbelief. The words landed like thunder, guilty of arson, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. He was sentenced to prison, his freedom stripped away. My mother, who had once orchestrated every manipulation with crocodile tears and whispered guilt trips, lost all rights to manage finances, her authority dismantled in a single stroke of the gavel. I felt the weight of years of submission lift slightly from my chest. The news spread quickly. Local papers ran with headlines like "Family Betrayal Ends in Courtroom Scandal" and "Daughter Wins Case Against Her Own Blood." Reporters camped outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as I walked past, their questions a blur I barely registered. The city buzzed with shock and outrage, not at me this time, but at the family who had preyed upon their own. The domino effect began almost immediately. My brother's friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a convicted criminal. The neighbors who once whispered doubts about me now turned their whispers against my parents, their eyes filled with judgment rather than suspicion. My father, who had remained silent through most of the proceedings, found his reputation in tatters. The company where he worked quietly pushed him into early retirement. Invitations stopped arriving at their doorstep, the very community they once controlled with intimidation and lies now rejected them outright. It should have felt like enough. Watching their power crumble, their carefully constructed facade collapse into dust, was a vindication years in the making. Yet, as I stood outside the courthouse, the autumn air biting my skin, I realized something deeper. Legal justice was powerful, yes, but the real victory wasn't written in court records. The real victory was within me. For the first time in my life, I was no longer tethered to their expectations. I didn't have to answer midnight calls demanding sacrifice. I didn't have to carry the shame they projected onto me. The invisible chains of guilt had been broken. That feeling, freedom, was something no verdict could ever capture. I returned to my apartment, now filled with boxes of evidence I no longer needed, and sat in silence. For years, my identity had been the dutiful daughter, the one who gave, endured, and obeyed. That role had been shattered in flames, but from its ashes, something new emerged. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor. More than that, I was a strategist who had faced the people who knew me best, the ones who thought they could control me forever. And I had won. This transformation was more intoxicating than any revenge. I began to notice the ripple effect of my fight. Strangers reached out, emails, letters, even handwritten notes. Left at my lawyer's office, people told me their own stories of betrayal. A father who drained his daughter's savings, a sister who forged signatures, a husband who turned a family against his wife. They told me my stand had given them courage to take their own. It was humbling. For so long, I thought I had been alone in my suffering. Now I saw the truth. Family betrayal was not rare. It was a hidden epidemic, cloaked in silence and shame. My story had cracked that silence open, and others were stepping through. Of course, freedom came with scars. Nights still brought dreams of fire, of my mother's voice in the dark, of papers sliding across the dinner table, with my name already written. Healing wasn't instant, and I didn't pretend otherwise, but each scar reminded me of what I had survived. They were not marks of weakness, but of resilience. I stood in front of the mirror one morning, studying the reflection staring back. For years, I had seen someone weary, beaten down by obligations I hadn't chosen. Now I saw strength, not the loud, boastful kind, but quiet strength, the kind forged in trials, tested in flames, and proven in the face of betrayal. Justice had given me closure, but it wasn't the gavel that set me free. It was the moment I decided I would no longer be their victim. It was the boundaries I erected, the voice I reclaimed, the identity I rebuilt. That was the true satisfaction, the kind of justice no court could deliver. Still, as I looked at the life before me, I knew the journey wasn't over. Freedom was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something larger. I had broken my own chains, but there were countless others still trapped in theirs. My fight had given me a new purpose, not just to live unshackled, but to show others it was possible. The verdict had closed one chapter. My future would open another. And though the battle in court had ended, the war for myself, for the life I deserved, was only just beginning. The silence after the verdict was unlike any silence I had ever known. For the first time, my phone didn't ring at odd hours with demands or accusations. There were no group messages dripping with guilt, no whispered slanders passed along by relatives. The absence of noise felt like a gift, one I intended to protect fiercely. I started with the simplest but hardest step: no contact. I blocked numbers, deleted email addresses, and instructed my lawyer to handle any necessary communication. For years, I had been trained to answer every call, to respond to every plea. Now I reclaimed that power by choosing silence. Financial safety followed. I closed joint accounts, froze credit reports, and hired a financial advisor to track every thread they had once pulled. The forged loan had taught me a brutal lesson. Money was more than numbers. It was control. By securing it, I secured myself. Every statement I reviewed without dread, every balance I checked without fear, was another wall in the fortress I was building around my life. Boundaries stretched beyond money. Emotionally, I stopped accepting guilt as currency. When old acquaintances hinted I should forgive and forget, I answered simply, forgiveness was mine to give, but access was not. Socially, I chose friends who valued honesty, not obligation. Professionally, I drew clear lines, refusing to let my family's shadow creep into my career. Slowly, I transformed from the woman who bent under every demand into what my therapist jokingly called the boundary queen. It wasn't about building walls to keep people out. It was about constructing doors that only I had the keys to. One evening, I sat in my new home, a modest but bright apartment filled with light. The air was still, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for chaos to strike. I thought back to the girl who had answered her mother's 2 a.m. call, desperate to be loved by proving her loyalty. That girl had been erased in fire and lies, but from her ashes I had rebuilt myself. With each decision, each boundary, I was teaching myself. Love doesn't demand self-destruction. Yet the story didn't end with building walls. True healing meant creating a future worth living in. With my financial freedom secure, I began investing time into my career, chasing opportunities I had once turned down out of obligation. Projects flourished, and with success came confidence that no one could take credit for. My health improved too. Sleep returned. Anxiety loosened its grip, and I found joy in small routines: morning runs, cooking meals for myself, laughing with friends without the weight of family drama in the background. Relationships became a new frontier. I no longer rushed into connections desperate for approval. Instead, I allowed trust to build slowly, testing the ground before stepping forward. For the first time, I surrounded myself with people who saw me as an equal, not a resource to exploit. It was strange, even disorienting, to be valued for who I was rather than what I could give. Strange but beautiful. Legacy became my guiding star. Breaking the toxic cycle wasn't just about saving myself. It was about ensuring no one after me endured what I had. I spoke at community events, sharing my story not as a tale of tragedy, but as proof of survival. I mentored younger women who struggled with family manipulation, showing them the tools I had once learned the hard way. Each time I told my story, I felt the ripples expanding outward, weakening the silence that had protected abusers for generations. Looking back, I saw the thread clearly. I had been conditioned to be a doormat, someone who believed love meant sacrifice without end. But now I stood tall as someone who had fought, survived, and thrived. From doormat to boundary queen, that was my case study, my transformation. On quiet nights, I still felt the scars, Memories of fire, of whispers, of papers pushed across the table would sometimes return. But instead of dragging me under, they reminded me of my strength. They were proof of what I had overcome, markers of a journey that had shaped me into someone unbreakable. As I looked ahead, my heart no longer carried dread. It carried hope. Hope for a career built on my own terms. Hope for relationships rooted in respect. Hope for a legacy where love was not measured by sacrifice, but by freedom and authenticity. The future stretched out before me, vast and uncharted, filled with unlimited potential. I didn't just survive my family's betrayal. I didn't just fight back in court. I built a new life from the ruins they left behind. And as I closed the chapter on my old self, I knew one truth above all. I had not only survived, I had learned how to shine.